All right, we'll get started. Thanks to everyone in the room for sticking around. If you're doing work, that's totally cool. If I say one thing that perks your ears, even if you're multitasking, I'll deem that a success. So thanks for sticking around on a Thursday afternoon. My name's Noah. I'm with a company called Axonius. We're going to talk about shrinking the attack surface today. I think a topic that's super important to dive into. So I wanted to start by framing it this way, which is actually with the second law of thermodynamics. Now, disclaimer, I am not a physicist. I can't tell you everything about thermodynamics. I bet there's someone in the audience who might be able to educate me on thermodynamics. But if you boil it down, the second law of thermodynamics, it essentially states that everything gets more complex over time. When I'm thinking about the attack surface, I think this rings true, right? And this is kind of the frame of reference that really helps me think about the attack surface. Everything's becoming more complex, whether that's attack behavior, whether that's the technology environment that we're all tasked to secure. So this is really a good frame of reference for today's talk. So I'm going to talk about what is the attack surface and how's it changing. So let's all define it first so that we all kind of see it the same way. And then obviously, how's it changing today? And how's it changed over the last few years? And then I want to spend most of the time thinking about fundamentals on shrinking the attack surface. There's a lot of steps that we can take that are fundamental to actually reduce the risk of exposure, reduce the risk of compromise. And happy to take any Q&A, and if anyone has any at the end. So attack surface 101. Here's a basic definition of attack surface. When I boil it down, I think of an attack surface as everything you have in all the ways that they possibly could be compromised. So all entry points that can compromise any or all assets. I'm curious if anyone has a differing definition or if this kind of sounds similar to the way you might think about an attack surface. I don't see a lot of disagreements. So with that, a provocative statement that I don't really believe is that provocative, right? I don't think any one organization can defend their entire attack surface, right? So that's why we're talking today about shrinking it, right? Controlling what you can to reduce that attack surface. A company can have all the tools, all the personnel in the world, but with today's digital environment, simply covering everything is not really possible. I think we all know this. So how's the attack surface changed? Obviously, if you went back 10, 15 years ago, digital environments were pretty simple, right? You had endpoints, you had servers within a traditional network, 4 company walls, maybe a firewall, and securing this environment was a lot more simple than it is today. So this is, 10, 15 years ago. Obviously, a lot's changed. Over time, we added mobile. We added multiple identities. We added custom and internet-facing applications. We added all sorts of digital assets, including websites. If you look at it closer to today, it's obviously expanded much more, right? We have digital supply chains. We have third and fourth party vendors. We have IoT devices that are connected to corporate networks and also home networks. We have obviously collaboration tools. On the right-hand side, we have cloud workloads and SaaS applications, which have absolutely exploded in the last few years, with SaaS spend actually surpassing cloud infrastructure spend. So this is no surprise to anyone, really. I think everyone's familiar with how the attack surface has expanded. But when I mean that everything's become more complex, this really helps you visualize the complexity of what that attack surface is and how it keeps expanding. I also want to briefly keep in mind, how do attackers think, right? We know that most attackers go after the path of least resistance. So you can see this chart here on the right. This is from the latest Verizon data breach investigation report. You can see that most attackers start with the basics, right? Just scanning for something that's public-facing, anything that's communicating out to the internet. They might use automation in the form of crawlers or bots, right, to try and compromise an application, or again, anything that's public-facing that they can easily find. And then as you get down to more sophisticated methods, right, you have your malware, your exploits, and your exploits against known vulnerabilities. And so these are really the methods that we want to minimize, right? When I get into the fundamentals, I'll talk about what are the fundamentals that can counteract these common attack vectors. So 4 steps in terms of fundamentals in my view. The first is continuous and comprehensive asset discovery. It's really hard to shrink an attack surface if you don't know what your attack surface looks like. And knowing what your attack surface looks like really requires a really good grasp on asset discovery. Once you've discovered those assets, right, applying security controls wherever you can. So ensuring that you have good security control coverage across the assets you've discovered is also, in my view, very fundamental. You gotta also validate those security controls, right? It's one thing to just deploy a security control. It's another to actually test it, ensure that it's actually working as designed and detecting known attack behavior. And then step 4, finally, you've deployed security controls, you've tested them, they're working. You're always going to have some residual risk, right? You're always going to have some known vulnerabilities in your environment, and you have to go about prioritizing what matters most, right? Like I said, no one can ever fix 100% of what they know. So how do you go about prioritizing the residual risk that might exist after you've applied and validated security controls? So let's talk about that first step, continuous and comprehensive asset discovery. So when I'm talking about assets, assets might mean different things to different people. In my view, some of the common things that people are likely looking at are obviously devices, right? Physical, virtual, IoT, OT, workstations, connected medical devices, right? This could be totally different depending on the line of work you're in and the kind of work that your company does. It could also be your network infrastructure, right? Your routers, your firewalls, your switches, anything that actually controls network access for the devices. Obviously, it's going to be your cloud infrastructure if you're using cloud service providers, if you're using platform as a service applications. Those are part of your attack surface, right? You may not be required to secure the actual infrastructure itself, but you're probably required for securing the access, the data that goes through it, if you're all familiar with the cloud shared responsibility model. It's also now SaaS applications. I mentioned that the attack surface is expanding. SaaS applications, in my opinion, is one of the biggest vectors in which the attack surface is expanding. So you see this graphic here on the right. This is a common visual of what the average company has in terms of SaaS applications. Most companies now have hundreds of SaaS applications their employees use, whether they know them all or whether they don't. So this is an interesting area where attack surface is expanding, and inventorying SaaS apps is now becoming pretty critical to understanding where your data resides and how to secure it. Your employees are obviously part of your attack surface too. And in terms of assets, right, you can deem user accounts or identities, your employee accounts, the way they access corporate applications, devices. Those are assets you want to inventory and track. Of course, code repositories for obvious reasons. I think there's many more, right? I could list web certificates, I could list many other things. But when we're talking about asset discovery, these are some of the things that I deem pretty critical to get a hold of on a frequent basis as part of continuous and comprehensive asset discovery. So how do you actually get comprehensive and continuous asset discovery, right? A lot of teams are still using spreadsheets or databases as an asset repository to understand what they have. And that's a good start. It's good to have that rather than nothing. But what we really find is that fetching data from multiple perspectives is very important, right? You might have a scanner that goes out and identifies assets, and that's really great. But how often are you running that scanner? That could be a monthly basis. That could be even less than a monthly basis for a lot of companies. Someone's cheering me on over there. You could also have directory services. You can have agents that exist on devices. There's so many perspectives and so many data sources that you probably have on your assets that just exist in different places, right? So fetching data from all these various perspectives, unifying that data in some way really helps actually drive more comprehensive asset discovery rather than relying on one or two sources. Fetching data on frequent intervals. I just mentioned scanning is a great method, but not everyone can scan every day. So understanding what data you have, you might be able to glean network data on a near real-time basis. You might be able to fetch information about your cloud infrastructure, again, on a near real-time basis, as you probably need to, given the dynamic nature of cloud. So being able to actually fetch this data on a continuous basis is also important. And then being able to just tag which assets are critical, right? You've gathered a wide array of assets. You understand which assets are unique within your environment. But tagging those critical ones is important because you know that you're going to focus on these as you monitor over time. So that second fundamental that I mentioned is security control coverage. So the premise here is that any asset that misses a security control increases your attack surface, right? Earlier, I defined the attack surface as everything you have plus all the ways that could be compromised. And the security controls help reduce the ways that they can be compromised for obvious reasons. This is the biggest area that I believe companies can reduce their attack surface, right? We can't necessarily shrink the number of assets we have in our environment. We can't go to the CIOs of the world and say, let's stop using so much cloud. We can't stop going to our employees and say, stop buying all these SaaS applications for obvious reasons. But we can put controls wherever we can appropriately and trying to reduce the methods that attackers might be able to actually exploit these assets. So a laundry list of security controls. Obviously, not every company has all of these. But as you go across that asset inventory that you've conducted, that you're fetching on a continuous basis, it's important to understand where do these exist and where they not exist. As a company, we talk to so many people who believe they have a really good handle on how widely they've deployed something like an EDR solution. Later, it turns out they get more asset information, they understand more of what they have, and it turns out it's on 30 to 40% of the workstations that they intend to deploy something like an EDR agent on. So this is a really, really immediate way to, in my opinion, start to shrink that attack surface, is to really improve security control coverage wherever you can, right? I mentioned EDR, vulnerability assessment, ensuring that your vulnerability assessment scans cover a large scope of assets as far as they can. Mobile device management, if your employees are using their mobile devices to access corporate resources, this is a pretty critical security control in my view. We can go further down the list, but all of these are things to think about. I think security awareness training and phishing protection, these aren't really necessarily thought of as security controls a lot of times, but your employees, as I mentioned earlier, are part of your attack surface. So understanding what percentage of your employees have actually recently gone through a security awareness training in the last 90 days. Being able to understand security control coverage in that manner is also important. Phishing protection as well, network segmentation. Again, a lot of these things you might not have as a company, but whatever you do have, you want to understand how widely used and deployed is it. So security control validation. I mentioned you want to deploy those security controls to reduce the risk of compromise. You also want to actually validate that they're working, right? You can't just set and forget these things. Obviously, they require maintenance. So what do I mean by something that you want to validate in terms of security control? First, the versions on which they're running, right? A lot of things like an EDR agent are updated very frequently to be hardened against the latest attacks. If you're not running the currently supported version of these types of technologies, they might be more vulnerable to certain kinds of attacks. They also just might not be reporting back to a central management console as designed, right? Sometimes you deploy something and the connection back to a management console, since a lot of these things are SaaS-based, actually gets broken, whether that's unintentional or intentional. We all know that a lot of attacks, after attackers have gotten a foothold within a network, will disable something like an antivirus, right? and then they'll later go through the network and transverse it without being detected. So you want to actually ensure that these things, such as an EDR agent, are actually reporting back and actually are working on a frequent basis. And then actually just looking to make sure that they're actually configured correctly, right? Another common example in the endpoint security world is a company will buy a new security agent, and they'll run it in detection-only mode just to get a feel for the alerts and to get a feel for the maintenance of the solution. And then over time, they'll transition that over to prevention mode. But as you grow with a large company, it becomes very hard to actually verify that everything was switched over to prevention mode if that's the decision you made. So that's one example of ensuring that the proper policies are applied, right? You could think of this in terms of encryption as well, making sure that devices are actually turned on with encryption. There's various ways you can think about this. I provided a lot of examples in the terms of endpoint security, because that's what I know well, but these are great examples of things you actually want to validate. And there's a lot of ways you can go about validating these, right? A lot of this will come out in various exercises like a pen test or a red team exercise, and these are really great. The thing I often see, though, with pen tests and red team exercises is that's not necessarily across your entire attack surface, right? These are usually limited in scope, either to control costs or to control the findings. And these might only be conducted across a certain portion of your actual entire attack surface. They're also point in time, right? Nobody's doing a pen test on a daily basis. And so while you'll get really deep results out of them, they're point in time. So you might find something and 90 days later, those findings are almost completely different. There's other things like breach and attack simulations. These are also great, right? But these are also periodic. You can do them perhaps more frequently than red team exercises or pen tests. But again, those are kind of periodic. There is a way to continuously monitor this stuff, right? You can actually marry what you have in terms of security controls against all the assets you own. So monitoring that security control coverage, actually running conditions to identify things like security agents that are out of date or that aren't reporting back. There's a way to monitor all this stuff and to actually find it as it happens rather than whenever your next pen test is. All right, so I'm at the fourth fundamental, and this is all about vulnerability and risk prioritization, right? You've deployed security controls. You first understood your attack surface, first and foremost. You've deployed security controls, and you've actually validated them. That's not going to prevent everything. Everyone knows that. So you have to look at what's left over and how you prioritize that. There's always going to be more vulnerabilities than there are people to patch them. I don't think that's a controversial statement at all. Hopefully none of the statements I've said today are controversial, but I'm happy to debate that in Q&A or after the fact. What I put here on the right is from also the latest Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. It tells us a lot about the attack surface, in my opinion. And what you see is that breached organizations and also organizations that had a ransomware event, on average, had more vulnerabilities per host than those that didn't, which is not at all surprising. But what it tells us is getting that count of vulnerabilities per host down, right, would reduce the likelihood of breach in theory. So while you can't patch everything, while you can't reduce every single vulnerability, you can reduce the ones that matter most. And there's many ways of thinking of doing that. I listed a few here, right? CVSS, almost everyone has this at their disposal. A good starting place to think about what's an important vulnerability to look at. There's a lot more you can layer on top of it. Exploit likelihood. This kind of data has become very accessible. CISA obviously has just put out their known exploited vulnerabilities list. Anyone can go up there and grab that and understand which vulnerabilities are actually being exploited in the wild. There's other organizations that have open source intelligence about which vulnerabilities are being exploited in the wild, so anyone can get use out of that data. You also want to track things like vulnerability age, right? So how old are the vulnerabilities that exist in your environment? The reason being here is a lot of the vulnerabilities that are actually exploited are sometimes several years old. So everyone's usually concerned about the 0 days, like a log4j, but a lot of the ones that get exploited and hurt companies on an individual basis are these vulnerabilities that are several years old. Of course, you want to layer all this logic on top of your environment, on top of your attack surface, right? So thinking about which assets are internal facing versus those that are actually publicly facing the internet and could be exploited by an attacker without any foothold in your network. And then, in my opinion, most important, asset criticality, right? I mentioned tagging those critical assets earlier, being able to understand anytime there's a vulnerability on a host that's deemed critical to the company. It seems like an obvious thing to prioritize over anything else. And then compensating security controls, right? I talked a lot about security controls today. It's important to be able to discern whether an active vulnerability on a critical asset does or doesn't have a security control, right? That might choose how you prioritize it. A vulnerability that's found on a host that also has endpoint prevention. If you do some due diligence, perhaps that endpoint prevention agent can block that exploit for that vulnerability outright, right? So you want to take into consideration where your security controls exist, obviously hoping that they're validated, as well as asset criticality. So there's a lot of ways you can think about vulnerability and risk prioritization. I think a lot of companies are getting super advanced in this practice and really determining logic in terms of their own organization and not just CVSS score or what specific vendors say out of the box in terms of what they should prioritize. So in summary, I mentioned the attack surface is getting more complex. It's expanding. There's nothing really we can do to control that expansion. Technology over time obviously becomes more and more expansive and harder to get a grasp on, but we can leverage an 80-20 mindset, in my opinion. I think focusing on those fundamentals, really leveraging that 20% of effort to get 80% of impact is a mentality that, in my opinion, everyone should consider employing. I think it's kind of necessary these days, just given the pace of technology and the job we all have to secure that attack surface. So in my opinion, again, those fundamentals, a comprehensive and continuous view into your attack surface. It starts here. You can't really secure anything if you don't know what you have. And then really understanding your security controls, how they perform, and prioritizing any residual risk in the form of vulnerabilities or anything else that you find after you validated those security controls. With that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. If not, again, thank you for sitting through on a Thursday afternoon. I know the conference is almost wrapping up here and tomorrow, so thank you all for your time.